In this lesson, you'll be able to understand nationalism during Rizal's time and how Filipino national consciousness developed. Rizal was born in mid-19th century. Indeed, Rizal was a product of his own time. Thus, it is important to see the events in the world which happened during the 19th century, which probably shaped Rizal as our national hero. Remarkably, liberalism and nationalism were born during Rizal's time, primarily because of the American Revolution, which started 1775 and ended 1789, as well as the French Revolution from 1789 to 1799. Both revolutions gave birth to the idea that individual loyalty has to be to one's own nation, not to his or her colonizers, and that sovereignty resides in the people, not in the king. These revolutions weakened the power and influence of the monarchs in Europe. When they say monarchs, they were the kings, queens, emperors, and empress, and other royal rulers, because people started realizing the importance of the establishment of a nation where there is justice for all, self-determination, democracy, protection of civil, political, and other rights. This was also the time when people began to fight colonialism of imperial kingdoms and state. 19th century weakened the imperial powers which colonized many territories not only in Europe but also in South America, Asia, Africa, and others. In short, 19th century was a period of revolutionary political and social changes in the world because of the new ideas, philosophies, ideologies, even technologies and practices. The French Revolution was the first revolt aimed against the monarchs of France and advocated the formation of a nation with an ideology, liberty, fraternity, and equality. This was also the beginning of the emancipation of slaves in many parts of the world. It was the beginning of the age where people started to accept equality in this diverse world. Many black slaves were freed from slavery across Europe and Americas. In 1861, the year when Jose Rizal was born, the Russian Tsar Alexander II proclaimed the freedom of millions of Russian serfs or slaves. Alexander formally issued an imperial proclamation to free the serfs from their land owners. Also in the same year, the American Civil War started and ended in 1865, even if President Abraham Lincoln proclaimed the freedom of black American slaves in 1862. 19th century was also a period wherein different independent nation states were formed. In 1871, Italy has freed almost all of her states from Austrian invaders and established a unified Italy, with Rome as its capital through King Victor Emmanuel II. Also in 1871, the German states led by Prussia through Otto von Bismarck had defeated the French invaders and set up the German Empire. This is also known as the unification of Germany, in which the German Reich changed its form of government from monarchy to a republic. From 1871 to 1890, Otto von Bismarck became the first and longest-serving chancellor, was marked by relative liberalism, but became more conservative at the end of his term. It can be said that Germany became an imperial power in Europe by colonizing several territories in Africa during this period. We also know that the first industrial revolution started in 1760 and ended 1840 in Great Britain. Industrialization in many parts of Europe gained its momentum in the second half of the 19th century and further accelerated by the discovery of oil in 1859 and electricity in 1887 as sources of power. These were essential elements in the increase of production among many factories and industrial centers. This also enabled faster means of communication and transportation, which facilitated contacts with other countries for business and trade. During the age of industrialization, the birth of capitalism created new classes. First, the capitalists, which were the owners of the means of production, and second, the laborers, or those who sell their labor, which was essential element of production. Because of the need for cheap raw materials for many industries, powerful countries at the time needed colonies. And so, they expanded their territories. Hence, 19th century became a period of competition among countries which were mostly industrialized nations and used their military capabilities to get more raw materials from colonized nations. The countries which became competitive in colonizing other nations during this period were Great Britain, France, Spain, Russia, and Germany. Great Britain led many of these powerful nations by its colonial expansion in Asia and can be recounted in 1842. Hong Kong was ceded by Manchuria dynasty of China to Great Britain through the reign of Queen Victoria after the dynasty was defeated during the First Opium Wars. While in 1886, India, Burma, and Malaya were consolidated to the British Empire. France, too, with the help of Filipino troops under Spanish officers, captured Vietnam in 1857, Cambodia in 1887, and Laos in 1893. Another significant events in the 19th century were the scientific developments, such as John Dalton formulated the concept of atomic energy in 1808. In medicine, Louis Pasteur, a French scientist, discovered that germs cause diseases in man and in animals. Also during this period, Charles Darwin published his book explaining the theory of evolution in 1859. However, many of the scientific developments had significant consequences to humanity, such as many scientists impressed the importance of science on the mind of ordinary citizens. People developed optimistic faith in man's capacity to achieve progress. Many people began to think and believe that the only way to truth and objectivity is the method of science. These are all good. Imagine today, without all the scientific breakthroughs during the 19th century, probably our lives were still feudalistic. So thanks to the scientific discoveries during Rizal's time. There were also political changes during our national hero's time. World history will tell us that socialism and communism developed in the 19th century. One of the bad effects of industrialization was capitalism that magnified the ancient labor problem, which is the inequality and conflict between masters and slaves, feudal lords and serfs, monarchs and their subjects. Socialists asserted that government should own and control the means of production for the benefit of all and not only a few abusive capitalists. In other words, the rich became richer while the poor became poorer, which is a result of industrialization. People became aware and vigilant on the issue that the rich capitalists are continually exploiting the poor laborers. The advocates of socialism and communism, led by Karl Marx, believed that the government should monopolize production to prevent abusive capitalists who exploit their laborers, and that incomes of industries should be distributed to the people equally so that there will be no poor who suffer from poverty. In 1848, he reiterated in his work The Communist Manifesto that only a violent revolution could improve the lives of the workers. Private ownership of land and means of production should be abolished, and that government shall have central control of all the industries. In theory, communism would create a classless society of abundance and freedom, in which all people enjoy equal social and economic status. They believe with confidence that in communism or socialism, there will be no rich and poor people. Moreover, 19th century was also a period of political changes because of democratic movements that time. This began as a political program of the liberal middle class, but later on included members from the lower classes. The aim of these movements was to fight for the welfare of the average individuals, or what we call common people. The democratic movements in Europe and Americas forced government to be more concerned with the welfare of the masses. The fact that leaders are elected by people, thus, the electorates became powerful in influencing their leaders to act on the promotion of general welfare. It is also a fact that during the 19th century, Philippines was still a colony of Spain. We try also to see the trends and events in Spain during this period. Spain during the 19th century was characterized by political instability. Spain was occupied by Napoleon Bonaparte from 1808 to 1814, which led to a massive destructive war of independence driven by an emergent Spanish nationalism. During the war, Spanish resistance leaders attempted to establish a liberal government and proclaim a Spanish constitution in 1812, which limited the power of the monarch and later on established a Spanish Cortes, or the Spanish Parliament. In other words, revolutionary changes were embraced by Spain during this period, probably because of what was happening in Europe and other parts of the world at the time. Nakiuso rin ang mga Espanyol sa mga pangyayari sa Europa noong mga panahon na yon. Unfortunately, monarchy was restored through a bloody war. The liberal reforms started in Spanish society were opposed by the new King Ferdinand II, particularly the Cadiz Constitution of 1812 and the Spanish Cortes or Parliament. King Ferdinand tried to bring back the power of monarchy despite the disagreement from the liberal groups. There were bloody revolts and conflicts between two emerging groups, which were the conservatives, or those supporters of the monarchs, and the liberals, which advocated reforms. This created two factions that generated long years of chaos due to internal divisions and conflicts. The liberals, who advanced democratic ideas such as equality, protection of rights, and many more, while the conservatives wanted to preserve the monarchy and privileges of the upper classes. The political instability adversely affected the Philippines, creating frequent changes and brief tenure in its top colonial administration, leading to inefficiency and corruption. In 1876, a Canobite system, or rotativism, or turno pacifico in Spanish, which literally means peaceful turnover, was agreed upon to save Spain from political disunity. The Canobite system, however, was very successful in maintaining peace in Spain until the end of 19th century. Spain as an imperial power in the world weakened also during the 19th century. This century was marked as the twilight for Spain's colonial power. While rising imperial powers gained more territories, Spain lost many of its colonies such as Paraguay in 1811, Argentina 1816, Chile 1817, Colombia and Ecuador 1819, Venezuela 1822, Peru 1824, Bolivia 1825, Costa Rica, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Mexico got their independence all in 1821. Not only that, Spain also abandoned mercantilism. In 1834, Spain was already finally convinced to abandon mercantilism or the feudalistic economic system aimed at increasing the wealth and power of the country by strict governmental regulation of the entire national economy and establishment of foreign trade monopolies. Sa madaling salita, monopolyo ng gobyerno ang pagnenegosyo, pag-aangkat ng mga produkto at iba pang mga kinalaman sa ekonomiya under the mercantilism. Remember that time industrialization in Europe started and people preferred free trade. Spain embraced laissez-faire capitalism or the principle that economy works best if government does not interfere with private industries and businesses. Hence, markets became free and deregulated. This forced Spain to end the galleon trade monopoly and allowed private businesses and industries and opened the Philippines to the whole world for trade and commerce. Now, let us also see what was happening in the Philippines during the 19th century. The social system existing in the Philippines that time was far different from the social changes in Europe. The society was still feudalistic in nature, brought about by the Spanish encomienda system, which has made Filipinos landless. Kung sa Spain ay makabagong lipunan na sila noong 19th century, sa Pilipinas naman ay makalumang feudalistic pa rin. Ibig sabihin nito, kontrolado pa rin ng mga enkomyendero ang produksyon at mga negosyo sa bansa, kaya karamihan ng mga Pilipino ay mga pesanteng manggagawa at alipin ng mga Espanyol. In addition, the Spaniards still proliferate the doctrine of limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood, which created social rankings among many groups and later became the source of social tensions which victimized the lower classes. This resulted to widespread discrimination, arrogance, injustice against the Filipinos and even Chinese living in the Philippines that time. The social classes in the country that time were the Peninsulares. They were full-blooded Spaniards who were born in Spain and occupying the highest positions. Some historians say they came here only to amass wealth and have power. The Insulares, they were also Spaniards born in the Philippines. They were given lower positions but discriminated by the Peninsulares. Spanish mestizos were the Spaniards with Spanish and Filipino parents. They were also discriminated by the Spaniards, but for the Indios, they were considered as Castilla. Ilustrados were the natives educated under Spanish schools, while Principalias were the town's ruling classes and native elites. They were composed of the gobernadorcillos, cabezas de barangays. Many of them were descendants of the Datus and the Maharlikas. Encomienderos were the privileged landowners, while the inquilinos were the rich merchants and successful tenants of the encomienderos. Chinese mestizos were children of Chinese and Indio parents who controlled the local economy. And at the bottom were the Indios. They were the masses, the common people, the lower classes composed of landless peasants and poor tenants. They were grossly abused, mistreated, and called various derogatory names like barbaros, bastos, sinvergüenza, and ignorante. In terms of political system, from 1572 to 1821, the Philippines was under the Viceroy of Mexico. But when Mexico gained its independence in 1821, the Philippines was under the control of Spain's Ministry of Colonies or Ministry of Ultramar, based in Madrid. The Ministry of Colonies administered the Philippines through a central government in Manila headed by Governor General. The Gobernador General, the chief executive of the colonial government and ex officio president of the Royal Audiencia, also had legislated powers. The Governor General made laws for the colony which were called actos acordados. He had also complace power, or the power to decide which law or royal decree should be implemented or disregarded in the colony. The alcalde mayor, or the provincial governor, exercised the executive and judicial functions. This was the most corrupt position because of the indulto de comercio, which was the privilege of the alcalde mayor to engage and monopolize trade in the different provinces. Gobernadorcillo, on the other hand, was called as town mayor and principally responsible for tax collection, while the cabeza de barangay served as barangay captain, as we call it today, and was in charge in maintaining peace and order, including tribute collection. Lastly, the Royal Audiencia was the Supreme Court of the colony. It acted as the auditor of government finances, and the governmental affairs are usually referred to this Supreme Court. The colonial government had also its police force. This Guardia Civil was organized in 1867, which was composed of Filipino police but led by Spanish officers, and was intended to deal with brigands and outlaws. But in 1880, it was used to arrest everyone denounced by the friars as filibusteros, or the enemies of the state, and herejes, which were the enemies of the church. Still in the Philippines during Rizal's time, Philocracia was still prevalent. It simply means rule of the friars. It was believed that friars were more powerful and influential than government officials that time. The friar was the supervising representative of the Spanish government in all local affairs. Friar curates became so influential and powerful that Spanish authorities, including the Governor General, feared them. According to Graciano Lopez Hena, Philocracia is rule of the friars because of an invisible government they have created using faith of the people to the teachings of the church and the influence of the friars in the daily lives of the people. What made the friars so powerful and influential? From 1849 to 1898, 45 governor generals had been assigned to the country, and each of them sought the counsel of the friars. The governor generals, who were mostly military officers, were no longer perceived as representatives of the stable monarchy, but of partisan politicians in Spain. Since friars were found in each town, they gradually became the rulers. Astoundingly, friars' powers include local election supervisor, school administrators, chairman of the Board of Taxation, Health, and Charity. They also serve as account inspectors of the gobernadorcillos and cabeza de barangay, while serving as local civil registrar and prison inspector. 19th century can also be characterized as most corrupt. The sources of government powers and abuses were the vast powers of Governor General and his lack of moral strength to resist corruption for material advancement. Many Governor Generals after their terms became very, very rich. The lower positions were appointed by Governor General or sold to the highest bidder through the Almoneda Publica. Those who sought or who bought their positions have to make sure that they get more than they have paid. So they were led to collect more taxes from the people. Let us also take a look at the educational system in the Philippines during the 19th century. The friars occupied a dominant position since the schools are parochial schools. Fear of God is emphasized and obedience to the friars as servants of God were instilled in the minds of the learners. Unfortunately, Indios were constantly reminded that they are inferior compared to the Spaniards and other European races. Thus, this resulted in the lack of self-confidence among Filipinos and even inferiority complex. The friars decided what they taught to the children. Learning was memorizing. They were also taught in the vernacular, even if there was a law requiring that they should be taught in Spanish. Pupils attended classes on the ground floor of the convent or in barns of masonry or corner of town's hall. What were the most serious criticisms against the educational system that time? First, over-emphasis on religion. Second, limited and irrelevant curriculum. Third, obsolete classroom facilities. Fourth, inadequate teaching materials. Fifth, absence of economic freedom. And sixth, racial prejudice against Indios in the school. The Spanish government actually had offered the teaching of the Spanish language through the Educational Decree of 1863. Unfortunately, this was opposed by the friars because they believed that knowledge of the language would develop social and political awareness among the natives, and they might be inspired by liberal ideas about freedom and independence. That's why they did not fully teach Spanish language to the Indios. The friars thwarted whatever noble purposes the mother country had for improving colonial education, mainly because they wanted to protect and perpetuate their vested interests. The Moret Decree of 1870, for example, it was intended to secularize higher education in the Philippines, but this was vigorously opposed by the friars because they wanted the Filipinos not to learn too much. Hence, some middle-class natives like Jose Rizal continued their studies abroad. This is because they know that they will learn better in other schools in Europe than in the system of the different schools run by the friars in the Philippines. Okay, that's all for this lesson. Thank you very much for listening.